I never planned on staying in the cabin that night. It wasn't mine, and I had no real business being there. It belonged to a man named Leonard, a guy my dad had known for years. A family friend, but not the type we were close to. More like someone you saw once in a while and nodded at out of respect. He was an old-school woodsman, a hunter, a man who lived off the land more than he did off any job. His cabin sat deep in the forest, far from the nearest road, tucked away in a clearing where barely anyone went unless they had a reason to. I hadn't spoken to him in years. Last I heard, he was getting too old to maintain the place and was thinking of selling it. But when my dad passed, I found out Leonard had left the cabin to him in some sort of informal agreement. No official will, nothing legal, just the kind of thing old men do, trusting a handshake more than paperwork. And now, since my dad was gone, it fell to me. I didn't want it. I wasn't the type to live out in the woods, cutting firewood and hunting deer. I barely even camped, but something about letting it sit out there, alone and forgotten, bothered me. So, I decided to drive up one weekend and take a look. Maybe I'd fix a few things, make sure it wasn't falling apart, and then figure out what to do with it. It was late October, and the drive took longer than expected. The road leading into the woods was worse than I remembered. Deep potholes, overgrown brush scraping against my truck. By the time I reached the cabin, the sun was already low in the sky, casting long shadows across the clearing. The place was exactly as I remembered. A small wooden structure, weathered and gray, with a slanted tin roof and a porch that sagged slightly in the middle. The front door was locked, but the key was still hidden in the same spot under a loose plank on the porch. When I stepped inside, the air was stale, carrying the scent of old wood and dust. I spent the next hour checking the place over. The roof didn't leak, which was a relief. The walls were solid. A few mice had found their way inside, judging by the droppings in the corners, but nothing too bad. The wood stove was still intact, the firewood stacked neatly beside it. I had planned on leaving before dark, but time slipped away from me. The sun was gone before I even realized it, and I wasn't in the mood to drive back down that terrible road at night. The idea of staying in the cabin alone didn't exactly sit right with me, but it was better than wrecking my truck trying to get out in the dark. I lit the old kerosene lamp on the table, started a small fire in the stove, and sat down on the creaky wooden chair near the window. The forest outside was silent, the kind of silence that made your ears ring. No wind,
No distant howls.
just stillness. After eating a sandwich I had packed, I settled in for the night. I wasn't tired, not really, but there wasn't much else to do. There was no electricity, no cell service. Just me, the flickering lamp, and the old wooden walls surrounding me. That's when I heard it. A soft crunch outside. A footstep. I froze, listening. It wasn't an animal. I knew the sound of a deer stepping through the brush, the way small creatures moved. This was deliberate, slow. I reached for the old hunting rifle Leonard had left behind, propped against the wall. I wasn't even sure if it worked, but having it in my hands made me feel better. I stayed still, waiting. Then another sound, this time closer, right outside the front porch. I tightened my grip on the rifle, my breath shallow. The door had a simple latch, nothing that would hold against real force. I kept waiting, every muscle in my body tense. Minutes passed. Nothing. Then, without warning, the doorknob moved. Not violently, just a slow, testing turn. My heart pounded so hard I could hear it in my ears. I didn't move, didn't make a sound. The knob twisted again, this time a little harder. Then it stopped. Silence. Whoever was out there was thinking. I swallowed hard, forcing myself to stay calm. The lamp on the table cast shadows against the walls, making everything feel smaller, tighter. I debated blowing it out, but that would mean sitting in total darkness. The porch creaked. Then came a long, dragging sound. like someone was pulling something heavy across the wooden boards. I wanted to call out, to demand who was there, but something in me knew better. Speaking would only confirm I was inside, alone. Then, just as suddenly as it started, the noise stopped. I sat there for what felt like an hour, rifle in my hands, barely breathing. I kept waiting for another sound, another sign that whoever was out there hadn't left. But there was nothing. Eventually, I forced myself to stand and move to the window. Slowly, carefully, I pulled the curtain back just an inch. The porch was empty. I didn't sleep that night. I kept the rifle close, my eyes on the door. Every little sound made me jump. The creak of the cabin settling, the crackling of the fire, even my own breath. When dawn finally came, I stepped outside. The air was cold, damp. The ground was covered in fallen leaves, undisturbed. But on the porch, right outside the door, were footprints. They weren't boot prints, not sneakers, bare feet, and they led back into the trees, disappearing into the forest. I didn't stay to investigate. I grabbed my bag, locked the cabin behind me, and left. The drive back felt longer than before, every shadow along the road making my skin crawl. I never went back. I don't know who was out there that night or what they wanted. But I do know one thing: Leonard left that cabin behind for a reason. And I wasn't gonna stick around long enough to find out why. It was the summer of 2004 when my dad's friend, Mark, invited me to his cabin deep in the woods of northern Minnesota. I had just turned 22, fresh out of college, and had nothing better to do. Mark was a good guy, one of those friends my dad had known since high school, the kind of friend who was more like an uncle. He owned a hunting cabin in the middle of nowhere, a place where he'd go to unwind, fish, and escape the busyness of life. I had been up there once or twice with my dad when I was a kid, but this was the first time I was going alone. The drive out took longer than I remembered. Mark had given me detailed directions, but the roads were all dirt, and some of the turns were barely marked. I had to backtrack a couple of times before I finally found the right path. The last few miles were rough, the kind of road that made you feel every rock and dip in your suspension. The trees grew thick, crowding the road on both sides, and by the time I reached the clearing, the sun was already starting to dip below the horizon. Mark's cabin wasn't much to look at. It was a small, one-story structure with a green metal roof and weathered wooden siding. A wraparound porch extended along the front, with a single rocking chair that looked like it had been sitting there for decades. There was a shed off to the side, a rusted propane tank, and an old fire pit surrounded by a few logs. Beyond that, it was just trees, miles and miles of them, stretching in every direction. Mark had told me he wouldn't be there when I arrived. He had some work to finish up in town and would be coming up the next morning. He left a spare key hidden under a loose plank on the porch and told me to make myself at home. Inside, the cabin smelled like old wood and damp fabric. It was small but comfortable, with a single main room that had a kitchenette, a couch, and a wood-burning stove. A short hallway led to a bedroom and a bathroom. There was no TV, no cell service, and barely any electricity, just a couple of dim battery-powered lanterns. Mark had left a note on the kitchen counter telling me there was food in the cooler and extra firewood outside if I needed it. I spent the first hour settling in, unpacking my bag and getting a fire going in the stove. The woods outside were already dark, and the silence was heavy. No distant hum of traffic, no voices, nothing but the occasional rustle of leaves or the call of an owl. I had forgotten how quiet it could be out here. After heating up a can of chili and eating by the dim lantern light, I decided to step outside for some fresh air. The porch creaked under my weight as I leaned against the railing, staring out at the tree line. The moon was barely a sliver, and the stars were swallowed by the thick canopy overhead. It was the kind of darkness that made you feel exposed, like something could be standing just a few feet away and you wouldn't even know it. Then I heard it, a branch snapping. It wasn't loud, but it was close, maybe 20 yards out, just beyond where my eyes could see. I held my breath, listening. At first, I thought it might be an animal, a deer maybe, but then I heard another noise, a slow, deliberate movement through the underbrush. Not the quick, startled steps of an animal, but something heavier, something careful. I grabbed the flashlight Mark had left on the counter and flicked it on, sweeping the beam across the edge of the woods. Nothing, just trees and undergrowth. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something was out there, just beyond the reach of the light. I told myself it was just my imagination, that I wasn't used to the isolation, that the silence was playing tricks on me. I shut off the flashlight, went back inside, and locked the door behind me. I didn't sleep well that night. Every little noise outside made me jolt awake, my heart pounding in my chest. Around 2 a.m., I swore I heard footsteps on the porch, slow, deliberate steps, the wood creaking under the weight of something heavy. I stayed frozen in my sleeping bag, staring at the ceiling, barely breathing. Eventually, exhaustion won over fear, and I drifted off. The next morning, I woke up to find the front door unlocked. I knew I had locked it. I was sure of it. But now it was open just a crack, the morning breeze pushing it against the frame. I checked the cabin. Nothing was missing. Nothing looked disturbed. But that didn't make me feel any better. I stepped outside, scanning the ground. The dirt in front of the porch was soft from recent rain, and there were footprints, deep, heavy ones leading up to the door. They weren't mine. They were bigger. I didn't wait for Mark to arrive. I packed my bag, grabbed my keys, and got the hell out of there. I didn't care if it made me look paranoid. Mark called me later that day, asking why I had left early. I told him everything, the noises, the door, the footprints. He was quiet for a long time before he finally spoke. "You did the right thing," he said. "You should have never been out there alone." I never went back to that cabin. Mark still owns it, but he doesn't go out there as often as he used to. Every now and then, he'll mention something strange. Things moved inside the cabin, footprints appearing where no one should have been. He doesn't talk about it much, and I don't ask. I don't know who or what was out there that night, but I do know one thing. I was not alone. I was 21 when I went on that trip. It was supposed to be just another college getaway. Something fun, something to break up the stress of midterms. A few of us had been talking about it for weeks. We wanted to go somewhere far from campus, somewhere quiet, where we could just drink, unwind, and not worry about classes or work. One of my friends found a cabin up in the mountains, a place that wasn't too expensive, and we all chipped in for a long weekend. There were 6 of us. We packed up on a Friday afternoon, stuffing our bags into the back of 2 cars, loading up on cheap food and beer, and heading out just before sunset. The drive wasn't supposed to take more than a couple of hours, but once we left the highway, the roads got worse. Potholes, sharp turns, stretches of nothing but trees on either side. The GPS kept losing signal, and after a while, we were just following printed directions and hoping we were still on the right path. It was dark by the time we got there. The cabin sat at the end of a long, narrow dirt road, surrounded by thick woods. There were no streetlights, no other houses nearby, just trees and shadows stretching out in every direction. The place itself was old but sturdy. Wooden walls, a wraparound porch, a stone chimney jutting up into the sky. Out back, there was a small fire pit and an old shed, the door hanging slightly open. We unloaded the cars, set up inside, and started drinking. The first night was loud. Music, laughter, the usual. No one was worried about the remoteness of the place. If anything, that was the appeal. No neighbors, no noise complaints, just us and the woods. But something felt off. Even that first night, I noticed it. It wasn't anything obvious, just a feeling, like the air around the cabin was too still. The woods were silent. No wind, no distant sounds of animals. Every now and then, I thought I heard something. A branch snapping, leaves rustling. But whenever I looked outside, I saw nothing. I didn't think much of it then. It wasn't until the next day that things got worse. We spent most of Saturday hiking. There was a trail behind the cabin that led up into the hills, and we followed it for hours. The trees were thick, towering overhead, blocking out most of the sky. It felt like we were walking deeper into nowhere, the world shrinking down to just the narrow path and the dense forest pressing in around us. At some point, we found an old clearing. There were signs that someone had camped there once. A fire pit, some scattered trash, the remains of a tent half buried under leaves. It looked abandoned, like no one had been there for years. We didn't stay long. Something about that place felt wrong, like we weren't supposed to be there. The others joked about it, kicking at the trash, making up stories about whoever had camped there before. I didn't laugh. I just wanted to leave. On the way back, I kept hearing things. Not close, not loud, but there. The sound of footsteps in the brush, just off the trail. The others didn't seem to notice, or if they did, they didn't care. I tried to tell myself it was just the woods, just animals moving through the trees. But that night, back at the cabin, I heard it again. We had the fire going out back, drinking, laughing, same as the night before. But the woods felt different. There was a weight in the air, something pressing down, making it harder to relax. At some point, I got up to grab another beer from inside. When I came back out, I saw something in the trees. At first, I thought it was just a trick of the firelight, a shape standing at the edge of the woods, half hidden by the dark. But as I stared, my eyes adjusted, and I realized it wasn't just a shadow. Someone was standing there. I froze. The others were still talking, still drinking, not paying attention. I didn't move. I just watched. Whoever it was didn't move either. They just stood there, barely visible, just outside the reach of the fire's glow. I don't know how long I stared. Felt like forever. Then, in the time it took for me to blink, they were gone. I didn't say anything. I don't know why. Maybe I thought I had imagined it. Maybe I didn't want to sound paranoid. I just sat back down and tried to act normal. But I couldn't shake the feeling that we weren't alone. I didn't sleep that night. Every time I closed my eyes, I felt like something was watching me. At some point, I heard movement outside. Slow, deliberate footsteps circling the cabin. I lay still, barely breathing, listening. Then, a sound at the window. Not knocking, not scratching, just breathing. I wanted to look. I wanted to turn my head to see if something was really there. But I couldn't. I just stayed frozen, staring at the ceiling, waiting. Eventually, the breathing stopped. The footsteps moved away. I didn't sleep after that. By morning, I was convinced I had imagined it. Lack of sleep, too much to drink. It had to be my mind playing tricks on me. Until I stepped outside. The ground around the cabin was covered in footprints. Not ours. These were different, barefoot. Dozens of them circling the cabin, leading out into the woods. I woke the others. No one had an explanation. No one wanted to stay another night. We packed up fast, throwing our stuff into the cars, not talking much. As we drove away, I looked back one last time. There, at the tree line, was a figure, standing still, watching. We didn't stop. We didn't go back. And we never talked about it again. I hadn't stepped foot in the old cabin for years. It had been my family's for decades. a small, sturdy place tucked deep into the woods. My grandfather built it with his own hands, and it had stood through storms, harsh winters, and long summers. I used to spend weekends there, chopping wood, fishing in the nearby creek, and staring up at the night sky through the clearing in the trees. But life moved on, and I stopped visiting. The last time I had been there was almost 10 years ago. I had been young, barely in my 20s, full of life and without any real responsibilities. Now, in my 30s, the cabin felt like a relic of another time, something left behind but not forgotten. It was late October when I finally returned. The days were getting shorter. The air carried that crisp bite of winter approaching. Leaves had already turned, covering the ground in layers of orange and brown. The drive took longer than I remembered, mostly because the old dirt roads were worse than before. I had to take it slow, steering around deep ruts and fallen branches. By the time I reached the cabin, the sun was already sinking. The place looked the same, though the wood had darkened with age. The porch sagged a little more and the windows were dirtier, but it was still standing, still solid. I killed the engine, stepped out, and let the silence settle around me. The woods had a way of swallowing sound. No traffic, no voices, just the distant rustling of wind through the trees. I unlocked the door and pushed it open. The smell inside was a mix of dust, wood, and something faintly musty. I flipped the light switch, and to my surprise, the electricity still worked. I had expected to rely on flashlights and lanterns, but the old wiring had held up. The place was simple: a small living area with a wood stove, a kitchen, a bedroom, and a bathroom. There were still some of my grandfather's things lying around: an old hunting knife on the shelf, a stack of yellowed newspapers near the fireplace. I set my bag down and got to work. I checked the cabinets, finding a few canned goods that were probably too old to eat. The water didn't work. The well pump must have failed over the years. No big deal. I had brought enough supplies for the weekend. I started a fire in the wood stove to take the chill out of the air. The dry logs caught quickly, the flames casting flickering light across the room. I pulled a chair closer and sat down, letting the warmth sink in. That was when I first noticed it. Something felt off. First, I couldn't put my finger on it. The cabin was exactly how I had left it all those years ago. Nothing had been moved. Nothing was broken. But there was this strange feeling in my gut, something that made the hairs on my arms stand up. I brushed it off as paranoia. It had been years since I'd been here. It was natural to feel a little uneasy. The silence, the isolation, the weight of old memories. I told myself that was all it was, but that feeling didn't go away. As the night deepened, the woods outside grew darker than I remembered. There was no moon, just an empty black sky stretching over the treetops. The fire crackled softly, the only real sound in the cabin. Then I heard it, a noise outside, a dull thud, not a branch falling, not an animal. It was something deliberate, something solid. I sat up, heart suddenly hammering in my chest. I strained to listen, but there was only silence. I told myself it was nothing, just my mind playing tricks. But then it came again. Thud. Closer this time. I stood, moving slowly toward the window. The glass was dirty, smeared with years of dust and grime, but I could still make out the trees. Nothing moved. I grabbed the old hunting knife from the shelf, just in case. Another sound, this one from the side of the cabin. A scraping noise. I felt my breath catch. I wasn't alone. I moved toward the door as quietly as I could. My boots barely made a sound against the wooden floor. I reached for the handle, hesitated, then slowly unlocked it. I stepped outside, knife in hand. The air was colder than before. The fire inside had made the cabin warm, but out here, the chill bit deep. My breath fogged in front of me. The trees stood still, no wind, no movement. I scanned the area. Nothing. Just as I started to relax, I noticed something in the dirt. Footprints. Not mine. Fresh ones, leading around the side of the cabin. I turned sharply, my grip tightening on the knife. My pulse pounded in my ears. I took a slow step forward, following the tracks. They led toward the back of the cabin, disappearing into the trees. I stopped, listening again. Silence. Then a rustle. Close. Too close. I turned just in time to see a shadow moving between the trees. A figure. Someone was out here, watching me. I backed toward the cabin, my chest tight with panic. I reached the door, stepped inside, and locked it behind me. I grabbed my flashlight and shined it out the window. Nothing, but I knew what I saw. Someone was out there. The next few hours were the longest of my life. I sat by the fire, knife in hand, every muscle in my body tense. I kept waiting for another sound, another sign. Then, just past midnight, it happened. The door handle moved. Not the wind, not an accident. Someone was trying to get in. I leapt to my feet, heart pounding so hard it hurt. Then bang. The whole door shook. I backed away, my mind racing. There was no one I could call. No neighbors, no nearby houses. Bang. Another hit, harder this time. I ran to the back of the cabin. The window was my only escape. I shoved it open and climbed through, landing hard on the ground. I turned and sprinted for the trees. I didn't stop. I didn't look back. I ran until my lungs burned, until my legs felt like they would give out. Only then did I finally turn around. The cabin was just a dark shape in the distance, and in front of it, standing in the firelight, was a man, tall, motionless, watching me. I never went back. I reported it to the police, but nothing ever came of it. They found the cabin untouched. No signs of forced entry. No footprints. Nothing. But I know what I saw. I know someone was out there, and I know they were waiting for me. I sold the cabin soon after. Let someone else have it. I never wanted to see it again. I was never one to scare easily. I had grown up hunting, fishing, and spending nights alone in the woods since I was a teenager. By the time I was in my late 30s, I had seen my fair share of strange things in the wilderness. Odd noises, shadows moving in places they shouldn't, even the occasional drifter who looked like he had no business being that far out. But nothing, and I mean nothing, compared to what happened when I spent a week at my uncle's old hunting cabin in northern Montana back in 2015. My uncle Ray had owned that cabin for decades. He used to take me and my cousins out there when we were kids, teaching us how to track deer, skin a rabbit, or set up camp if we ever found ourselves stranded. The place was a simple structure. One big room with a wood stove in the center, a small kitchen area, and a cot against the back wall. There was an outhouse about 30 yards away, and a tiny shed where he kept tools and extra supplies. It wasn't luxurious, but it was functional. Ray had passed away a few months before, and his cabin was left abandoned. I hadn't been up there in years, but something about it called to me. Maybe it was nostalgia. Maybe it was the need for some time away from everything. Either way, I packed up my truck with enough food, water, and gear to last a week, and I made the drive out there alone. The cabin was deep in the woods, miles from the nearest town. The dirt road leading up to it was rough, barely more than a trail. By the time I arrived, the sun was already dipping low behind the trees, casting long shadows over the clearing. The place looked just as I remembered it. Weathered logs, a slanted metal roof, and that old familiar smell of damp wood and pine needles. I got the door open with the spare key I had and stepped inside. Dust had settled over everything. Cobwebs stretched from the rafters. A few old hunting magazines were stacked on the table, exactly where Ray had probably left them. It was strange being there alone, but I didn't mind. I spent the first night getting settled, clearing out some of the dust, and starting a fire in the wood stove. I cooked a quick meal, had a couple of beers, and stretched out on the cot, listening to the wind move through the trees outside. It wasn't until the second night that things started to feel off. I had spent most of the day hiking around the property, checking the old deer blinds, and making sure everything was still in good shape. When I got back, I noticed something that hadn't been there before. A single footprint in the dirt near the shed. It wasn't mine. I had been all over the area that day, and I knew for a fact I hadn't stepped in that spot. The print was deep, meaning whoever left it had been standing there for a while. I looked around, trying to convince myself I was overreacting. Maybe it was an old print that had just been uncovered by the wind. Maybe I had missed it earlier. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. That night, I locked the cabin door, a habit I normally didn't bother with out there. I sat by the fire, trying to ignore the uneasy feeling in my gut. The woods were silent, too silent. No owls, no distant rustling of deer moving through the brush, just the wind. I didn't sleep well. Every little noise made me sit up, listening. I kept my rifle close, though I told myself I was just being paranoid. The next morning, I stepped outside and froze. The footprint was gone, not covered up, not washed away by rain, just gone, as if the dirt had been smoothed over perfectly. I stared at the spot for a long time, trying to make sense of it. Maybe I had imagined the whole thing. Maybe I was losing it. But deep down, I knew that wasn't the case. I spent the rest of the day trying to keep myself busy, chopping wood, checking the fishing traps down by the creek. But that creeping feeling of being watched never left me. Every time I turned my back, I felt it. Every time I walked away from the cabin, I glanced over my shoulder. That night, things escalated. I woke up around 2 in the morning, heart pounding, but I didn't know why. The fire had burned down to embers, casting faint orange light over the room. Then I heard it, a soft creak, not from inside the cabin, from outside. I sat up slowly, every hair on my body standing on end. I reached for my rifle, keeping my breath steady. The sound came again, closer this time, near the porch. Then nothing. Minutes passed. I listened so hard my ears started ringing. My eyes adjusted to the darkness, and I turned my head toward the small window near the door, and I saw him, a figure just beyond the glass, tall, motionless. His face was impossible to make out in the dark, but he was there, staring. I gripped my rifle tighter, my pulse hammering in my ears. Then, without a sound, he turned and walked away, disappearing into the trees. I didn't move for the rest of the night. By morning, he was gone. No footprints, no sign that anyone had been there. I didn't waste time packing up. I threw my gear into the truck and got the hell out of there. I don't know who he was or what he wanted, but I know one thing. He had been watching me long before I ever noticed him, and that, more than anything, is what still keeps me awake at night. It was the kind of cold that settled in your bones, the kind that made every joint ache even before the wind hit your face. The cabin was old, small, and the kind of place that had been built for hard winters and harder men. I had been working as a forest ranger for a few years, covering a stretch of remote woodland in Montana, and I had stayed in a lot of different cabins before. Some were well-maintained, stocked with supplies, and even had working radios. Others, like this one, were barely standing, left to rot in a part of the woods most people didn't want to go. The station sent me out to check on a hunting permit issue, poachers most likely, who had been seen too close to restricted land. It was supposed to be a routine overnight shift, just a last check-in before I moved on to the next sector. I had parked my truck about a mile away, where the dirt trail ended, and hiked in through thick trees with my pack slung over my shoulder, carrying enough food for a night, my rifle, and my radio. By the time I reached the cabin, the sun had already started to drop behind the treeline. The place was barely holding itself together. The wooden walls were warped from the seasons, and the roof sagged under the weight of too many heavy winters. There was no electricity, no working plumbing, and no guarantee the old wood stove inside would even work. The last ranger who stayed here had left months ago, and I doubted anyone had come through since. I forced the swollen door open and stepped inside. It smelled of damp wood, dust, and something else. Something stale like old sweat or rotting fabric. The inside was just as rough as the outside. A cot sat in the corner with a thin, stained mattress. A rusted stove took up most of the back wall. A small wooden table sat in the middle of the room, its surface covered in scratches. I set my pack down, checked the stove, and found just enough firewood stacked inside to last the night. I didn't plan to sleep much anyway, just make it through the night, log whatever I saw, and get out in the morning. The sun dipped lower. I stepped outside, scanning the tree line, taking in the sounds of the forest. It was quiet, too quiet. Not a single bird, no movement in the underbrush. Just the wind through the trees and the occasional creak of old wood as the cabin settled behind me. Something about that silence put me on edge. In the deep woods, even in winter, there was always something moving. Rabbits, deer, even the distant call of a coyote. But here, nothing. I shook the feeling off and started a fire inside. The warmth helped, but it didn't take the edge off. The wind picked up outside, rattling the walls and whistling through the gaps between the logs. I sat at the table, my rifle propped up against the leg, and took a sip of coffee from my thermos. Then I heard it, a noise outside, a crunch, like a footstep. I froze, listened, nothing. I stood up slowly, moving toward the window. The glass was old and fogged, covered in dust, but I could just make out the dark shapes of trees outside. My truck was too far away to see, but the trail I had hiked in on was visible. I watched, waited, still nothing. I told myself it was just the wind, maybe a branch breaking under the weight of ice. I had spent enough time in the woods to know that your mind could play tricks on you when you were alone. Still, I reached for my rifle, resting it against my leg as I sat back down. Another crunch, closer this time. My heart pounded. It wasn't the wind. It wasn't a tree. Something was moving outside. I stood up and slowly unlatched the door. I opened it just enough to look out. The cold air hit my face, sharp and biting. The trees stood still, the snow on the ground untouched. But I knew something had moved. I knew it. I waited. Nothing. I closed the door, locking it this time, and sat back down. The fire crackled behind me, casting long shadows across the walls. I kept my rifle in my hands now, my pulse still racing. Then I heard something else. Breathing. It was faint, just beyond the walls of the cabin. Slow, steady, not an animal. Too controlled, too deliberate. I swallowed hard, gripping my rifle tighter. I had been in the woods long enough to know what animals sound like. This wasn't an animal. I moved to the window again, peering out into the night. The wind had picked up, and the trees swayed slightly, casting strange shapes across the snow. But then I saw it, a figure, standing just at the edge of the treeline, still, watching. My blood ran cold. It wasn't a bear. It wasn't a hunter. It was a person standing too still, too quiet. I couldn't see any details, just the outline against the trees, just the shape of something human but wrong. I stepped back from the window. The breathing outside had stopped. I waited. Nothing. Then, a sound against the door. A scratch. Slow. Purposeful. I raised my rifle, aiming at the door, my hands steady despite the hammering in my chest. The scratching stopped. Silence again. The wind howled outside. The fire crackled. My own breath felt too loud in the small space. Then, footsteps. Slow, deliberate, moving around the cabin. Whoever it was, they weren't trying to break in. They were waiting. I stayed awake all night, never lowering my rifle. The footsteps would start and stop, sometimes near the window, sometimes by the door. At one point, I heard something scrape against the wall. Fingernails, a knife, something dragging. Then, just before dawn, the sound stopped. I waited, listened. Nothing. The first light of morning crept through the trees. I forced myself to move, to get up, to check outside. I unlatched the door, rifle ready, and stepped out onto the frozen ground. Tracks. They circled the cabin, moving back and forth. Some were deep, like whoever had been out there had been standing in place for a long time. Then I saw something else. A message carved into the wood of the cabin wall. Not yet. I didn't waste time. I packed my things, grabbed my rifle, and hiked back to my truck. I didn't look back. By the time I reached the ranger station, I was shaking. I told my supervisor I wasn't going back to that sector. They didn't ask why. A week later, the cabin burned down. No one knows how. I never went back. I never found out who or what was out there that night. But I know one thing. They'll be back. I spent the last winter in my uncle's old hunting cabin, deep in the woods of Montana. I had just turned 35, and life in the city had gotten too loud, too fast. My uncle, who had long since moved to Florida, offered the place to me for a season. It was old, isolated, but sturdy. The thought of being alone in the snow-covered wilderness seemed like the perfect way to reset my mind. The cabin sat about 20 miles from the nearest town, a 2-hour drive from the closest grocery store, and at least 5 miles from the next occupied property. It had everything I needed: wood-burning stove, a small generator, enough canned food and dry goods to last me the winter. I had a rifle for hunting, a radio for emergencies, and plenty of firewood stacked outside. The first weeks were peaceful. I spent my days chopping wood, setting traps for small game, and reading old books my uncle had left behind. Snow fell thick and steady, covering the world in silence. Felt like stepping into a forgotten place, untouched by time. Then, sometime in mid-January, strange things started happening. I woke one morning to find footprints in the snow. They weren't mine. They started at the tree line and ended just a few yards from my front door. No tracks leading away. The snow had stopped falling in the night, and these prints were fresh. I stepped outside, wrapped in my thick coat, and crouched down to inspect them. The prints were deep, heavier than mine, wider too. They weren't from an animal. Too large, too clean. Someone had been standing there, watching my cabin in the dark. I checked the area, circling around the trees, my rifle slung over my shoulder. No sign of anyone. The air was crisp, the forest still. Whoever had been there was gone. That night, I locked the door and set my rifle by my bed. Days passed without incident. I convinced myself the tracks were nothing. Maybe a hunter passing through, someone lost, someone curious. But then the whistling started. It came late at night, a high, slow tune carried by the wind. At first, I thought it was just the sound of the trees shifting, the wind squeezing through the branches. But it was too distinct. It followed a pattern. 3 notes, pause. 3 notes, pause. The first time I heard it, I sat up in bed, staring at the dark window. I told myself it was nothing, a trick of my own mind. The second time, I grabbed my rifle and sat in the chair by the window, waiting. Nothing ever came. A few days later, I went hunting deeper into the woods, hoping to clear my head. I knew the land well enough, followed my uncle's old maps. There was supposed to be nothing out there, just trees, hills, a frozen creek. But I found something that shouldn't have been there. A cabin. It was old, much older than mine, its roof half collapsed, its windows broken. It looked abandoned, like it had been left to rot decades ago. But there were footprints in the snow leading inside. I stood there for a long time, staring at it. It made no sense. There was no record of any other cabins nearby. My uncle never mentioned it. And yet, there it was. I walked closer, rifle ready. The door was slightly open, just enough for me to see inside. Something felt wrong. It smelled wrong, like damp wood and something else, something rotten. I turned back and left. That night, the whistling was closer. It was late February when things got worse. I woke to the sound of something scratching against the cabin door. Slow, deliberate, like nails dragging against the wood. I didn't move. I listened. The scratching stopped, replaced by the sound of footsteps, heavy, circling the cabin. My heart pounded in my chest. I reached for my rifle, my fingers gripping the cold metal. Then silence. I waited until the first light of morning before opening the door. There, in the snow, were more footprints. They circled the cabin twice before stopping at the window where I slept. I didn't sleep that next night. March arrived, bringing colder nights and heavier snow. I had planned to stay until April, but now I was counting the days until I could leave. One evening, as the sun was setting, I saw something in the trees, a shape tall and still standing between the branches. It wasn't moving, just watching. I raised my rifle, took a step forward. The figure stepped back, fading into the shadows of the forest. I didn't follow. That night, I barricaded the door with furniture, kept the fire burning until morning. My last night in the cabin, I knew I couldn't stay any longer. The fear had settled into my bones, deeper than the cold. I had packed my truck, ready to leave at first light. But something didn't want me to go. The whistling started just after midnight, closer than ever. The scratching returned, but not just at the door, at the windows, at the walls. It was surrounding me. I grabbed my rifle and backed into the corner of the room, my breath sharp, my hands tight around the stock. The sounds continued for hours, slow, deliberate, waiting. Then, just before dawn, silence. I didn't wait. As soon as the sky began to lighten, I grabbed my keys, my bags, and rushed to the truck. My hands were shaking as I turned the key. The engine sputtered, struggling in the cold. I looked up just once toward the tree line. There, half hidden in the shadows, was a figure, tall, still, watching. The engine roared to life. I slammed it into drive and didn't look back. I never went back to that cabin. I didn't tell my uncle everything, just that I had changed my mind about staying long-term. A few months later, I looked up old land records. The abandoned cabin wasn't on any map. No records, no history. Shouldn't have been there. I don't know what was in those woods. Person? Something else? I only know one thing. Something was watching me that winter, and it didn't want me to leave. I'm glad I did.